from desert tribesmen to world conquerors in just 2 decades. When Muhammad's followers burst from Arabia in 633 CE, 2 ancient empires trembled. Watch as the brilliant general Khalid ibn al-Walid leads lightning campaigns across Iraq, earning the title Sword of God as Persian armies shatter before him. Experience the desperate clash at Yarmouk, where outnumbered Muslims crushed Byzantine forces in a battle that sealed Syria's fate. Despite facing superpowers that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, Arab armies conquered lands from Egypt to Persia with stunning speed. Discover how faith, strategy, and timing forever changed world history. Heat shimmers above a desert road where caravan bells jingle faintly against the silence of the dunes. Camels sway under their burdens of frankincense and leather, their shadows long across the sand. A guide raises his staff toward the northern horizon, where, beyond the mirage, lies the marketplace of Bosra. Every journey carries risk, bandits waiting in dry wadis, thirst in the open wilderness, but every journey also carries fortune. In these early years of the 7th century, trade is the blood that keeps Arabia alive, and those who command its flow command power. Far from the Roman cities of Syria and the fire temples of Persia, Arabia appears to outsiders as a barren fringe. Yet between its mountains, its wadis, and its oases, countless clans pursue lives bound by custom and pride. Some tend goats on stony uplands, others guard palm groves whose dates sweeten caravans across the peninsula. In the west, the Hijaz, Mecca, and its rivals grow fat from commerce. In the east, tribes serve as Persian clients, guarding borders that stretch toward the Gulf. To the north, Arab foederati defend Byzantine outposts against Sasanian raids. Arabia is no void, it is a crossroads, a land where rival empires meet but cannot fully conquer. Those empires themselves stand weary. Byzantium and Persia have fought each other nearly to exhaustion, their fields littered with bones from decades of campaigns. Cities burn, treasuries empty, and soldiers limp homeward, carrying more scars than victories. Though their banners still wave above distant capitals, neither empire possesses strength enough to tame the tribes who inhabit the deserts between them. For the moment, the great powers look inward to recover, leaving Arabia to its own gods, its own customs, its own restless energies. Among the tribes, honor is treasure, perhaps more valuable than coin. Each insult demands repayment. Each oath binds families across generations. Feuds erupt over grazing land or insulted pride, only to be suspended during the sacred months when even the fiercest enemies lay down arms to ensure pilgrims' safe passage to holy places. In this delicate balance, a city has risen whose very stones proclaim its uniqueness, Mecca. At Mecca's heart stands the Kaaba, a cuboid sanctuary draped in cloth and crowned with idols representing gods of many tribes. To approach it is to enter neutral ground. Even enemies lower their voices here, for this is the house said to have been raised by Abraham himself. Traders circle its courts, setting up stalls heavy with spices from the south, silks from the east, and weapons forged in distant lands. Pilgrims mingle with merchants, so that devotion and profit intertwine. Quraysh, the tribe who controls the Kaaba, thrive on this union. Their caravans stretch from Yemen to Damascus. Their word carries weight in every corner of Arabia. To offend Quraysh is to invite ruin, but to ally with them is to share in their wealth. Yet beneath Mecca's prosperity lies unease. A man has begun to speak words unlike any heard before. Muhammad, son of Abdullah of Quraysh, once known simply as a trustworthy merchant, now recites revelations he claims come from the one true God. He calls idols hollow and urges men to abandon ancestral spirits. Some laugh at him, some strike him, yet a few listen with trembling hearts. His earliest followers are slaves and the poor, but also respected clansmen who believe the voice they hear through him is not of man, but of heaven. The city reacts with fury. Caravans depend on pilgrim trade, and pilgrims come because idols stand in the sanctuary. If those idols are cast down, who will visit? Quraysh elders see their order threatened. Whips fall upon converts, and stones are hurled at the small gatherings, where verses are recited in hushed tones. Still the message spreads, stubborn as desert grass breaking through rock. In time, persecution drives Muhammad and his followers to flee. At Yathrib, an oasis city to the north where feuding clans bleed one another dry, the emigrants find refuge. There, Muhammad becomes not merely preacher, but leader, forging a covenant among believers and local allies. Loyalty no longer rests solely in bloodlines, but in faith, a new brotherhood, an ummah, bound by shared devotion. The Constitution of Medina is proclaimed, its clauses stitching together tribes into something unfamiliar. A polity grounded not in vengeance, but in divine law. Around Medina, the desert itself becomes a training ground for this community. When Mecca sends forces to crush the movement, battles follow whose lessons echo far beyond their immediate outcome. At Badr, a small band of believers confronts a larger Quraysh army and, against expectation, prevails. The victory stirs hearts across Arabia, proof that conviction can topple numbers. At Uhud, the believers stumble, their line breaking under cavalry charge. Yet even in defeat, they learn discipline and unity. At the Trench, when Quraysh and allies besiege Medina, strategy triumphs over brute force. A defensive ditch carved in haste turns horsemen into helpless watchers, and a storm scatters the enemy. Each clash sharpens the ethos of the faithful. Courage alone is not enough. Patience, coordination, and trust in one another are weapons more potent than sword or spear. Veterans of these fights become seasoned leaders, their minds as keen as their blades. Arabia begins to notice that this community, once persecuted, now endures and even grows. Meanwhile, caravans still pass through the deserts. Bells still jingle on camel necks, and markets still bustle. Yet whispers accompany them, whispers of a prophet who calls for unity beyond tribe, of a city where rival clans have set aside blood feuds, of battles where the few have held against the many. Arabia is changing. The winds that sweep the dunes carry more than sand. They carry rumor, hope, and fear. No one yet knows how far those winds will blow, but those who stand on the ridges at sunset, watching caravans disappear into the gold-lit horizon, sense that something has begun, something greater than the fortunes of Quraysh or the rivalries of tribes. The desert, silent witness for millennia, prepares to echo with the march of armies and the recitation of verses that will alter not only Arabia, but the world beyond its sands. Dawn breaks over the stony ridges west of Medina, the first light turning the desert into a sea of fire and shadow. Dust lingers in the still air as two groups face each other, not with swords drawn, but with pens poised and hearts held tight. Beneath a low acacia tree, parchments are unrolled, and words are set down that will echo longer than spears striking shields. This is no battlefield. It is Hudaybiyah, the place where warriors braced for blood instead find themselves bound by treaty. What seemed like humiliation to many of the faithful, accepting terms that favored Quraysh, delaying the pilgrimage they longed to complete, became, with time, a breathing space sharper than any sword. The ink of Hudaybiyah, carved open the path that arms alone could not yet clear. It allowed the young community to strengthen itself, to mend wounds, and to prepare for a storm of campaigns that would soon remake Arabia. Medina, once a city of factions, now thrummed with purpose, its streets filled with soldiers drilling in the morning cool, merchants bartering under shade cloths, and scribes noting alliances that stretched further with each passing month. Around its walls, farms flourished under the protection of treaties and patrols. In its mosques, verses rang out that taught loyalty greater than blood, discipline keener than steel. The pause given by the treaty was not idleness, it was preparation. Not long after, the oasis of Khaybar felt the weight of this rising power. Behind its palm groves and fortified towers, Jewish strongholds once stood proud, their walls considered impregnable. Yet they fell, not in reckless charges, but in calculated strikes, one by one, until the banner of the believers rose above them. The campaign tightened the ring around Quraysh, cutting away allies and sending a clear message. Medina's arm was longer than any had thought. Grain, arms, and tribute now flowed into its markets, strengthening the resolve of those who once whispered doubt. The Quraysh, still swollen with pride, found their grip loosening. In the year 630, the city that had mocked the Prophet and driven him from its gates tasted the full measure of return. Mecca, ancient heart of Arabia, saw its gates opened not to slaughter, but to submission. Camel hooves clattered across its narrow streets as the conquerors entered, not as destroyers, but as reformers. Idols that had stood for generations were toppled, their stone faces shattered against the sanctuary's floor. Yet blood did not soak the stones. Instead, mercy prevailed, enemies forgiven, tribes welcomed back into kinship under a new banner. For Mecca's people, the transformation came swiftly. Markets buzzed as before, caravans set out as always, but the center of life was no longer idols carved by men. It was the proclamation of one God. For Arabia beyond, the fall of Mecca was thunder in clear skies. If the proudest of cities had bowed, who else could stand alone? Still, Arabia did not yield without test. At Hunain, tribes rallied with fierce pride, their numbers vast, their confidence unshaken. In a narrow valley, their charge thundered down upon the believers, scattering men and beasts in chaos. Panic might have undone the young army, but amid dust and cries, the Prophet's voice rang steady, calling his followers back to order. They turned, regrouped, and struck with renewed strength. By the day's end, the valley floor was strewn with broken weapons and fading banners. From Hunain, the tide rolled onward to Ta'if, where walls high and stout resisted siege until terms brought peace. Swift campaigning showed Arabia that resistance could delay but not deny the new order. Northward, the horizon widened. At Tabuk, the army marched to the edge of Byzantium's shadow. Harsh sun baked their backs, wells seemed scarce, and rumors whispered of Roman might waiting beyond. Yet no legions appeared, only silence and distance. But the silence was victory in its own right. The tribes saw that the community of Medina could march unhindered, stand poised at the gates of empire, and return unbroken. For the first time, the believers tasted the northern winds, and they knew more awaited beyond desert and mountain. Back in Medina, the final years unfolded as if all Arabia turned its face toward the oasis. One by one, delegations arrived, chieftains bearing gifts, tribes swearing allegiance, messengers seeking terms. The year of deputations, they called it, when tents sprang up like fields of white flowers around the city. Each day new banners approached. Each day new names were written into the rolls of loyalty. Arabia, fractured for centuries, began to gather under a single canopy. Within this swelling unity, the prophet prepared his people for what must come. Prayers filled the nights, councils filled the days. From among his companions, he appointed commanders, scribes, and envoys, shaping a cadre who could carry the burden when he no longer stood among them. Veterans of Badr and Hunayn, men seasoned in both loss and triumph, were readied not for rest, but for horizons beyond Arabia's rim. Their numbers, though modest compared to empires, carried a fire that exhaustion could not quench. In the year 632, the voice that had first sounded alone in Mecca's alleys grew faint. Muhammad, messenger and leader, departed this world, leaving behind no treasure but a community forged in discipline, mercy, and faith. Around him stood men and women who had endured exile, battle, hunger, and triumph, and who now faced a task greater than any before: to preserve unity, to carry the word, and to test their strength against powers that had once scorned Arabia as barren and weak. The desert winds blew as they always had, rattling palm leaves and sweeping across empty wadis. Yet nothing in Arabia was as it had been. From treaty to triumph, from exile to sovereignty, a storm had gathered. The tribes, once scattered as grains of sand, were binding into a single force. And beyond the northern hills and eastern rivers, two weary empires waited. Empires that would soon feel the march of those who had been tempered in fire, guided by vision and bound by something stronger than tribe. A faith that promised the world itself was open before them. The sun still hung low over Medina when the news spread like a desert fire. The prophet was gone. In AD 632, the voice that had summoned tribes to faith, that had turned feuds into brotherhood, was silenced. Shock gripped the community. Men wept openly. Others refused to believe death could touch him at all. Yet amid the grief, one man rose with a steadiness that kept the foundation from crumbling. Abu Bakr, companion of the Prophet and first of the caliphs, reminded the people that though Muhammad was mortal, the message he carried was eternal. The words calmed the storm. A leader stood where uncertainty threatened to tear unity apart. Still, beyond Medina's walls, winds of rebellion stirred. Tribes who had sworn allegiance in the Prophet's lifetime wavered, now that his voice was no longer present. Some refused to pay the zakat tax, claiming loyalty had died with him. Others followed new claimants, so-called prophets who promised visions and miracles of their own. The Ridda, the great apostasy, spread like cracks across the surface of newly forged unity. Arabia, just bound together, seemed ready to splinter again. Abu Bakr answered not with hesitation, but with resolve. Against the counsel of those who urged caution, he ordered that the expedition Muhammad had prepared in his final days must march north, led by young Usama ibn Zayd. To send soldiers outward when rebellion flared within seemed madness to many, yet the caliph insisted. The standard raised by the Prophet would not fall. And so, before addressing Arabia's defiance, he sent a column riding toward Byzantine lands, proving to friend and foe alike that Medina's mission had not ended. Once that banner flew beyond the horizon, Abu Bakr turned his gaze inward. Letters went forth to governors and commanders, summoning men to arms. Arabia would not fracture under his watch. Campaigns began across the peninsula, from the highlands of the center to the sands of the south. Each front carried its own dangers: swift raiders, fortified strongholds, and the wavering loyalties of tribes waiting to see who would prevail. In the east, leaders gathered followers. with promises of freedom from Medina's obligations. In the south, prophets rose from obscurity, claiming divine visions that rivaled Muhammad's. Among the most notorious was Musaylima, who styled himself messenger of God and gathered a host large enough to shake the confidence of many. His followers believed his words as fervently as the faithful clung to the Quran, and his banners drew thousands. Arabia became a chessboard of factions, each tribe weighing whether to resist, submit, or gamble on new leadership. Into this turmoil rode a man whose name would soon be whispered with awe, Khalid ibn al-Walad. Once a commander against the Prophet, he had turned his sword to the service of Islam, and now his reputation for speed and boldness made him the sharp edge of Medina's response. Where others counseled delay, he pressed forward. His cavalry struck swift and hard, scattering foes before they could unite. At every camp he encircled, at every well he seized. He left behind the message that rebellion brought only ruin. The struggle reached its fiercest pitch at al-Yamamah. There, Musaylima's forces stood in open fields. Tens of thousands braced for battle. The clash raged from dawn into dusk, men fighting through orchards and walls of spears, each side certain the fate of Arabia hung on their courage. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, with neither side yielding. In the midst of carnage, Muslim veterans pressed forward, step by bloody step. It was said that so many of those who had memorized the Quran fell that day, hundreds of voices silenced, that their deaths forced the community to preserve the scripture in writing, lest memory alone be lost. At last, Musaylima was struck down, his claim to prophecy extinguished in blood and dust. The field of al-Yamamah lay strewn with the fallen, a terrible price for unity. Yet from that ruin emerged a hardened core of commanders and soldiers, men tested by fire, their resolve steeled beyond anything Arabia had known before. Elsewhere, too, rebellion faltered. In central Arabia, Khalid's relentless marches broke tribal resistance before alliances could form. In the south, where false prophets had stirred, swift campaigns brought towns to heel. One by one, strongholds submitted, some by force, others by negotiation. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who yielded were welcomed back into the fold. By the year's end, the peninsula that had seemed ready to fracture now stood once more united under Medina's banner. From these campaigns came not only unity, but also experience. The commanders who led men through desert marches learned to ration water with precision, to strike before enemies could muster, to sustain armies on supply lines stretched across empty sands. The fighters who had once been farmers and merchants became seasoned veterans, their discipline honed, their courage proven. When they looked north and east toward the empires that had mocked Arabia as barren, they did so not with hesitation, but with confidence. By AD 633, the Ridda Wars had ended. Arabia stood bound tighter than before, its tribes now tempered by both rebellion and reconciliation. In Medina, Abu Bakr could at last look beyond the peninsula. To the north lay Syria, ruled by Byzantium's weary legions. To the east stretched Iraq, where Persian garrisons held fertile plains. Both empires, drained by their endless wars against each other, seemed ripe for challenge. The desert that had once been dismissed as a wasteland now held within it a force unlike any the world had seen, a force united by faith, hardened by trial, and led by men who believed their cause destined to stride beyond Arabia's horizons. The winds that had carried rumor now carried armies. The sands, once scattered, moved together in waves. And as the Ridda faded into memory, the world beyond Arabia's borders waited, unknowing, for the storm about to break upon them. Scarcely had the desert quieted after the Ridda Wars, when fresh banners began to fly. Arabia was whole again, its tribes gathered under a single creed, its warriors hardened by rebellion and reconciliation. Yet Abu Bakr, the caliph, knew unity was not an end, but a beginning. Beyond the peninsula stretched two great empires, Byzantium to the north, Persia to the east, both weary from decades of war, both sitting upon lands fertile and rich compared to Arabia's stones and sands. The question was not if the tribes would march outward, but where the first step would fall. To the east lay Iraq, a land of rivers and gardens, where the Euphrates and Tigris carved green corridors through the dust. Once a client kingdom under the Lakhmids, it now lay exposed, its Persian governors distracted by court intrigues, and its garrisons weakened by the endless duel with Byzantium. Abu Bakr judged it ripe, and into its fields he sent the man whose name already stirred awe, Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid, the sword of Allah, had proven himself in the Prophet's lifetime, turning defeat into victory, rout into rally. Now he rode with seasoned veterans at his side, men who had followed him through rebellion and seen his tactics bend fortune to their favor. His army was not vast, no more than a few thousand when compared to the numbers Persia could muster. Yet what it lacked in size, it carried in speed, cohesion, and faith. The opening clash came at Kazima. Persian forces, reinforced by Arab allies, thought to crush the newcomers quickly. Instead, they found themselves overwhelmed by sudden cavalry charges that split their ranks before their commanders could steady them. The battle was swift, the field left littered with broken shields, and the message clear. The desert warriors had crossed into Mesopotamia, not to raid, but to conquer. From Kazima, Khalid pressed onward to Al-Madar, known as Mazar, where the Euphrates shimmered beside the battlefield. Here the Persians assembled in greater strength, confident the river at their flank would secure them. Yet Khalid maneuvered with precision, using the waterways not as barriers, but as channels, striking where the enemy least expected. Arab horsemen cut across shallows, emerging where defenders had thought themselves safe. By sunset, the Persian line buckled, and the survivors fled upriver. The river carried away their dead, while Khalid's standards moved ever deeper into their land. But it was at Walaja that his brilliance shone brightest. The Persians gathered in greater numbers still, bolstered by reinforcements, determined to halt the advance. They believed sheer weight would break the Arabs, that numbers alone would smother the fire that had swept from the desert. Khalid answered with guile. He concealed part of his cavalry behind ridges, holding them as hidden claws while his infantry braced against the Persian assault. The battle raged, dust rising like storm clouds, until the moment came. At his signal, the concealed horsemen thundered into the flanks, closing like jaws. The Persian host, caught between front and rear, collapsed in chaos. It was a double envelopment, remembered for centuries, a maneuver of timing and precision that echoed Hannibal's triumph at Cannae, but born anew on Mesopotamian soil. After Walaja came al-ʿＡṣ, the river of blood. Persian reinforcements swore an oath to stand or die, and die they did. The fighting was savage, the riverbanks red with the slain, until the current itself seemed stained with the weight of death. Yet Khalid pressed on, unflinching, his cavalry driving survivors into rout. From there, Amgashia fell with little resistance, the townsfolk scattering before his approach. The jewel of the campaign lay further north. Al-Hara, the city once ruled by the Lakhmids, a seat of learning and faith where churches rose above bustling markets. Khalid's forces approached its walls, and after tense exchanges, the city yielded without devastation. Tribute was agreed, and the gates opened. The submission of al-Hara reverberated through Iraq, proof that the newcomers were not mere raiders to vanish, but rulers to stay. Beyond al-Hara, Khalid struck again, this time at Ain al-Tamr. The town resisted, but resistance melted before his cavalry's speed. Here, prisoners of noble blood were taken, youths destined to leave their mark upon the future, scholars and commanders alike shaped in later years by this sudden fall. To the north, raids stretched toward Dumat al-Jandal, the edge of Syria's deserts, extending fear into Byzantine lands as well as Persian. Still, the campaign was not done. At Firaz, Khalid faced not only Persians, but their Byzantine allies and Arab auxiliaries, all gathered on the banks of the Euphrates. It was a coalition meant to overwhelm, a final barrier raised against his advance. Yet once again, his tactics prevailed. Maneuver and timing turned numbers against themselves, and the field was won. It was the last great clash of his Iraqi campaign, a battle that signaled the limits of Persian resistance in that season. When Khalid at last rested his horse, Iraq lay shaken. From the Gulf's edge to the Euphrates frontier, Persian garrisons had been shattered, their confidence broken. In scarcely a year, with an army that never rivaled the vast hosts of empire, he had carved a path through fortified towns and open fields alike. The soldiers who followed him learned more than victory. They mastered the rivers, adapting desert speed to new terrain. They seized supplies from depots, using enemy stores to feed their advance. They discovered how to carry water across wastes, how to march with endurance that outpaced lumbering foes. These were not raids of plunder, but rehearsals for conquest, campaigns that tested what Arabia could bring against the world. Back in Medina, word of triumphs carried on caravans and letters. Abu Bakr, frail but unyielding, listened as reports reached him, of cities fallen, of commanders proven, of Persia's vaunted armies turned back again and again. His choice to send Khalid east had been vindicated, but the Caliph knew Iraq was not the only horizon. To the north, Syria beckoned, where Byzantium's banners fluttered above towns that had once dealt with Arab federati. Thus, even as Khalid completed his Iraqi campaign, new orders awaited him. Arabia's storm would not pause. From fertile Mesopotamia, the march would soon bend towards Syria, where Byzantine legions still claimed the land as their own. The desert sword, honed in rebellion and tempered in Iraq, would now be drawn against another empire. The dust of Iraq had scarcely settled when new commands reached Khalid ibn al-Walad. He had broken Persia's first defenses, seized cities, and shaken an empire, but the Caliph in Medina looked westward now. To the north, across the lava fields and stony plains of the Syrian frontier, Byzantium still claimed mastery. Their garrisons clung to fortresses along the caravan routes. Their banners rose above towns where Arab federati long served as their shield. If Arabia's storm was to spread, the gateway to Syria had to be forced open. From Medina came Abu Bakr's word. Khalid was to leave Iraq, gather his veterans, and march west to reinforce Muslim armies already pressing into Byzantine territory. It was an audacious order, for it meant leaving unfinished victories behind to confront an empire older and larger than Persia. Yet Khalid obeyed, and with him rode men whose names had been forged in the Ridda Wars and tempered in Iraq. The Syrian front was already aflame. 4 separate columns, under Abu Ubaidah, Yazid, Shurahbil, and ʿAmr ibn al-ʿAṣ, had advanced northward, each probing Byzantine defences. They fought skirmishes near the Jordan, clashed with garrisons at border towns, but none had yet struck a decisive blow. Against them, the Byzantines mustered local levies and called upon allies, determined to halt the desert warriors before they gained momentum. The balance hung uncertain, awaiting the man who could tip the scales. Khalid's journey west became legend. Rather than take the long, watered road through Mesopotamia, he chose the shortcut across the barren Syrian desert, a march so daring that even seasoned guides feared it. For 5 days and nights, his men rode through wastes where no settlement offered relief, where wells lay too far apart for safety. Camels carried water in skins. Some were slaughtered to quench desperate thirst. The sun burned like a furnace, yet the column pressed forward, guided by a Bedouin tracker who knew hidden paths between dunes and blackened basalt fields. When at last the army emerged near Suwa and Tadmur, they had covered near 600 miles in less than a week. They arrived not exhausted, but ready to fight, and their sudden appearance stunned the Byzantines who had not dreamed such a march possible. With Khalid's arrival, the scattered Muslim forces gained unity. Communications that had once faltered now moved swiftly under his coordination. He summoned the commanders, tightened the lines, and prepared to strike where Byzantium's screen seemed thinnest. The clash came at Ajnādayn in AD 634, a place between Jerusalem and Ramla, where Byzantine generals had assembled their strength to crush the Arabs once and for all. The field bristled with shields and spears, heavy infantry in disciplined ranks, cavalry waiting to charge on either wing. Facing them were the desert veterans, fewer in number but hardened by campaign after campaign. When the battle opened, Byzantine formations advanced with confidence, their armor gleaming under the Levantine sun. Yet Khalid directed the fight with precision, cavalry sweeping in waves, infantry holding firm under pressure. The Byzantines expected the Arabs to break. Instead, they found themselves pressed from all sides. By day's end, their lines wavered, broke, and collapsed into rout. The field at Ajnādayn was littered with discarded shields and abandoned standards. For the first time, a major Byzantine force had been defeated in open battle by the armies of Arabia. The shock rippled through Syria. Towns that once relied on Byzantine protection faltered in loyalty. Tribes long bound to the empire began to reconsider their allegiances. The victory was more than tactical. It was psychological. It proved that Byzantium could be beaten not only in raids or ambushes, but in pitched combat on chosen ground. Khalid wasted no time. Momentum had to be seized before the empire regrouped. From Ajnādayn, he drove northward, striking at Busra, a fortified town that commanded routes deeper into Syria. His arrival there was swift, his assault relentless. Busra's defenders, caught between fear and uncertainty, surrendered after brief resistance. With its fall, the southern gate of Syria swung open. Coordination between multiple armies followed. No longer did separate commanders grope forward independently. Under Khalid's direction, their movements aligned, converging upon targets with timing that magnified their strength. Caravans and spies fed him intelligence of garrisons and supply stores, much of it gleaned from Arab merchants who had long traded in Byzantine markets. Where the empire relied on slow couriers and rigid commands, Khalid's forces moved with fluid speed, exploiting every gap. The desert march had shown what endurance could achieve. Ajnādayn proved Byzantium's vulnerability. Busra's fall secured a foothold. Each step deepened the penetration into Syrian lands, each success encouraging allies to join and enemies to falter. Yet Khalid and his men knew greater challenges awaited: cities with walls, generals with experience, and emperors whose pride would not accept loss easily. But for now, as they camped under Levantine skies, the soldiers of Arabia could look back on the path they had carved. From the sands of the Hijaz, through the fire of rebellion, across the rivers of Iraq, and now into the heart of Syria. The storm had passed its first gate, and before it stretched a land rich in cities, fields, and fortresses. Byzantium had been warned, but the warning had come too late. The next struggle would bring them to Damascus itself, nightfall soft over the Ghouta plain, the orchards heavy with figs and apricots, the waters of the Barada River whispering through canals that have fed Damascus since time immemorial. Torches gleam on the city's walls, where Byzantine sentries pace nervously, eyes straining into the darkness. Beyond the glow of firelight, silence hangs, an army waits in the shadows. For the first time in centuries, Damascus, jewel of Syria, faces a siege not from rival empires, but from the desert warriors who only months before had been strangers to these lands. Khalid ibn al-Walad and his commanders had chosen carefully. Instead of striking the walls head-on, they moved methodically to encircle the city, cutting the roads and seizing the fertile ring of villages that surrounded it. The orchards that had once brought plenty to the markets of Damascus now fed the besiegers. The city's gates clanged shut, supplies dwindled, merchants whispered of treachery within. To the Byzantines, the siege was a nightmare. To the Muslims, it was proof that their victories in the open field could be pressed against the strongest fortresses of the empire. Inside Damascus, life continued under strain. Families huddled in courtyards, watching their stores of grain shrink with each passing week. The churches still rang with hymns, yet the faithful sang with unease. Traders grumbled that their wealth lay useless behind locked gates, and soldiers, once confident in Byzantine arms, began to question whether relief would come at all. Beyond the walls, the Muslim camps stretched in a ring. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, Shurahbala ibn Hassana, and ʿAmr ibn al-ʿAṣ all commanded sections of the encirclement, while Khalid roamed as master of maneuver, shifting troops where pressure was greatest. From orchards to river crossings, skirmishes erupted daily. Sallies by the defenders met with countercharges from the besiegers. Spears clashed, arrows whistled, but the circle tightened with every week. Tradition preserves tales of intrigue at the gates. One speaks of a Christian Arab who slipped word to Khalid of weaknesses in the northern defences, of guards willing to betray for survival. Another recounts how, as Byzantine negotiators stalled with Abu Ubaidah at one gate, Khalid's men scaled another, storming into the city even as terms of surrender were being set. However it unfolded, Damascus fell not in fire and slaughter, but in negotiation and compromise. Some districts yielded under promises of protection, others were entered by force. Yet the city was spared the fate of pillage that so often followed conquest. The capitulation marked more than victory. It revealed the shifting character of the campaign. No longer did battles alone decide the fate of cities. Diplomacy, negotiation, and calculated leniency shaped the conquests. The people of Damascus found themselves living under new rulers, yet their homes, churches, and markets remained intact. For many, submission brought less ruin than loyalty to distant emperors who could no longer protect them. Even as Damascus adjusted to its new masters, news reached the camps that shook the command. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, was dead in Medina. In his place stood Umar ibn al-Khattab, stern in judgment, clear in vision. His letters to Syria carried both reassurance and reproof. Policy would continue, the wars would not end, but his style of leadership would differ. Where Abu Bakr had trusted Khalid's daring, Umar valued steadiness. In one decisive stroke, he he removed Khalid from supreme command, appointing Abu Ubaidah in his place. The change stunned many. Soldiers who had followed Khalid through desert marches and river battles whispered in disbelief. Yet Khalid himself bowed to the order, serving loyally under the man now placed above him. For the army, it was a lesson in discipline. This struggle was not the glory of individuals, but the cause of the community. The sword of Allah would still strike, but not always from the hand that guided the host. In the weeks that followed, operations shifted. Instead of lightning raids and sudden maneuvers, the campaigns took on a slower rhythm. Sieges laid patiently, towns approached methodically, supply lines secured. Under Abu Ubaidah's leadership, the armies adapted to the reality of occupation. Garrisoning became as vital as conquering, stability as prized as speed. Marj al-Sufar, south of Damascus, became the next stage of struggle. Byzantine remnants, seeking to rally, gathered their forces, hoping to reverse the tide. The plain rang with steel once more, the two sides clashing amid dust and cries. Yet the Byzantines, already shaken by Ajnādayn and Damascus, could not withstand the seasoned veterans. They broke and fled, leaving the approaches to Palestine exposed. At Fārs, known as Pella, resistance stiffened. Byzantine troops, reinforced by local allies, fortified themselves near the Jordan. The siege dragged, the defenders determined to hold. Yet pressure mounted until at last the position collapsed. The fall of Fārs cleared the valley approaches, opening the road toward the heart of Palestine. Thus, by AD 634, the Muslim armies had established themselves firmly in Syria. From orchards of Damascus to plains of Jordan, they now held ground once considered beyond reach. Yet victories brought not ease, but greater tests. Byzantium would not abandon Syria without a final effort, and already Emperor Heraclius stirred in the north, mustering a vast host to drive the invaders back into the desert. As the armies rested from siege and march, word spread that the emperor's legions, drawn from Armenia, the Balkans, and the Levant, were assembling. Damascus had fallen, but Syria was far from secured. Ahead lay a battle, not of gates and orchards, but of fields and ravines, where the fate of the whole province would hang in balance. The storm gathered toward the Yarmouk River. Dawn crept over the basalt hills of the Yarmouk Plateau, casting long shadows across ravines that gaped like wounds in the earth. Mist curled from the river Ruqad, veiling its steep gorges, while beyond, the land rolled toward the Golan Heights. Here, in this harsh and broken landscape, the fate of Syria would be decided. Torches flared in the Muslim camp as riders tightened girths and checked spearheads. Across the plain, banners of Byzantium stirred in the wind, their ranks vast and glittering in the morning light. Two worlds faced each other, each knowing the days ahead would either seal or shatter empires. Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, had not come in person, but his hand was evident. After years of watching Syria crumble piece by piece, he had marshaled one last massive effort. From Armenia, from the Balkans, from Christian Arab allies, he drew contingents until the host swelled larger than any yet faced by the Arabs. Command he entrusted to Vahan, the Armenian general, while other lords led detachments of Greeks, Slavs, and Ghassanids. Their numbers may have reached 200,000, though chroniclers disagree. What mattered was that they dwarfed the Muslim forces gathered against them. Yet numbers alone did not decide battles. In the Muslim camp, perhaps 30 to 40,000 stood ready, veterans hardened by years of campaigning. At their center was Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, calm and steadfast, entrusted with overall command. But where steadiness alone might falter, Khalid ibn al-Walid waited with his mobile guard, 4,000 chosen riders, whose speed and discipline gave the Muslims a weapon Byzantium could scarcely match. Together, steadiness and daring bound the army like twin pillars holding a single arch. The battle opened in midsummer, AD 636, and it would rage for 5 days. At first, the Byzantines pressed forward with weight, confident their armor and numbers would crush the desert warriors. Shields locked, spears thrust, cavalry surged. The Muslim lines bent, but they did not break. Khalid moved his guard tirelessly, galloping from flank to flank, reinforcing wherever danger threatened. His men fought not as scattered tribes, but as one body, answering his signals with precision. On the second day, Vahan's army drove hard, nearly rolling back the Muslim left. Panic whispered along the line. Yet women in the rear, led by figures like Khawla bint al-Azwar, seized tent poles and swords, urging the men back into battle. Their cries shamed the wavering, and the line held. Each time retreat threatened, resolve stiffened, for all knew there was no escape. Behind them yawned the ravines of the Ruqad, deep chasms into which there could be no retreat. The third day saw desperate charges and countercharges. Ikrimah ibn Abu Jahl, once an enemy of the Prophet, rode with 400 companions who swore an oath to fight until death. They hurled themselves into the thick of Byzantine assault, holding the line at terrible cost. Few survived, but their sacrifice bought the army precious time. Dust choked the plain, and the clang of iron mingled with the shouts of men and the screams of horses. Still the battle remained undecided. By the fourth day, exhaustion gnawed at both sides, yet Khalid prepared a maneuver that would decide the struggle. As Vahan ordered another massive push, Khalid sent detachments sweeping around the Byzantine flanks, striking from unexpected angles. His mobile guard darted wherever the line wavered, hammering down with relentless force. Arrows darkened the sky, swords clashed in the press of men, and slowly the Byzantine host began to reel. The fifth day dawned with the battlefield, a wasteland of corpses and broken gear. Vahan resolved to crush the enemy once and for all, but fate turned against him. A sudden sandstorm swept across the plateau, blinding the Byzantines and cloaking their banners. The Muslims, shielded with the wind at their backs, pressed forward with renewed fury. Khalid ordered a final, all-out assault. His cavalry thundered, his infantry surged, and the Byzantine lines, already fraying, broke. Then came the rout. With ravines behind them, the Byzantines had nowhere to flee. Men stumbled, slipped, and fell into the gorges of the Ruqad, trampled by comrades or driven by panic into the abyss. Entire units dissolved in chaos. Chroniclers speak of tens of thousands perishing in those chasms, their cries echoing long after the fighting ended. Vahan himself fled, wounded and broken, his grand army destroyed. When silence fell at last, the field of Yarmouk lay thick with the dead. The scale of Byzantine loss was staggering. Their power in Syria was broken beyond repair. Heraclius, receiving the news in Antioch, is said to have turned his horse toward the north, lamenting, "Farewell, O Syria." The emperor withdrew to the safety of Anatolia, leaving the province to its fate. For the Muslims, Yarmouk was more than victory. It was transformation. No longer were they seen as desert raiders or lucky insurgents. They had met the might of Byzantium in open battle and triumphed. The conquest of Syria, once a daring ambition, now lay within their grasp. Damascus already theirs. They would move swiftly to secure the rest. Emesa, Homs, and in time, Jerusalem itself. The soldiers who survived Yarmouk carried more than scars. They carried certainty. They had stood against the greatest army the empire could assemble, and they had endured. Their commanders, Abu Ubaidah with his steadiness, Khalid with his brilliance, Ikrimah with his sacrifice, had shown that discipline and faith could master even overwhelming odds. The lessons of the Ridda, of Iraq, of Ajnādayn, all had converged here. Arabia's storm was no longer a gathering, it was a gale sweeping through empires. As the camps were struck and the wounded tended, the road ahead came into view. Syria was theirs to claim, but its cities still waited, fortresses with walls and gates, peoples with doubts and fears. Yet the fate of the province was sealed in those 5 days by the Yarmouk River. The next march would lead not to open fields, but to holy cities, where diplomacy and siege would decide what the sword had begun. The air above Damascus was still heavy with the memory of battle when word of Yarmouk reached its streets. Traders whispered the news in hushed tones. Mothers repeated it over cradles. Priests spoke of it in solemn sermons. The great army of Byzantium was gone. The city, once a Byzantine jewel, now lay firmly in Muslim hands, its markets humming again, its orchards heavy with fruit. But beneath the bustle lay a new truth. Syria had changed masters. Khalid ibn al-Walad and Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah wasted no time. Armies that had triumphed at Yarmouk did not dissolve into idleness. They pressed outward, ensuring no garrison or fortress could rise behind them. To the north stretched the valleys of the Orontes, dotted with cities loyal still to Byzantium. To the south and west lay Palestine, with its hill towns and holy places. Each road beckoned, and the commanders divided their forces to meet the challenge. At Hims, Emesa of the old Roman maps, the siege dragged into winter. Snow dusted the fields while soldiers huddled in cloaks around fires, their breath rising like smoke in the cold night. Byzantine defenders on the walls looked down at the camps, hoping for rescue that never came. Negotiations followed, terms were set, and at last the gates opened. Hims fell not to sack but to settlement, its people allowed to remain under guarantees of safety. Such terms became pattern. Resistance tested, then tempered with mercy. Farther along the Orontes lay Hamar. Its walls too resisted, but hunger and despair gnawed at resolve. Once the Arabs controlled the valleys, they secured not only the towns, but the lifelines of Syria. From the highlands, supply routes stretched southward, feeding the army as it marched. Meanwhile, Abu Ubaidah turned his gaze to the greatest prize of all, Jerusalem, Ilia to the Arabs, Aelia Capitolina to the Romans, the city of prophets and kings. The road southward carried the army through Palestine's rolling hills and rocky plains, past villages that had known centuries of conflict yet endured. In AD 637, the Muslim host encamped outside Jerusalem's walls, beginning a siege unlike any other. The defenders held firm. The city's walls, thick and ancient, had withstood Persians and Romans alike. Byzantine banners still flew, priests still intoned prayers within churches, and supplies within the walls stretched longer than expected. For months, the siege dragged on, punctuated by negotiations. Emissaries went back and forth, carrying terms, demands, refusals. The city's leaders insisted they would surrender only to the Caliph himself. And so, across the desert, messengers rode to Medina. Umar ibn al-Khattab answered the call. He journeyed north, not with a retinue of splendor, but with simplicity, riding a camel, wearing plain clothes, carrying little more than his staff. His arrival at the siege camp astonished both friend and foe. Here was no emperor cloaked in purple, but a man whose authority rested in character rather than pomp. When the gates of Jerusalem opened at last, it was into his hands that the keys of the city were placed. Accounts speak of his entry. Umar walking through streets heavy with history, gazing upon churches and shrines, refusing to pray within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, lest Muslims later claim it as theirs, instead praying nearby. The surrender was peaceful, the terms generous. Christians and Jews alike were granted protection, their places of worship preserved, their lives secured. Jerusalem passed not in flames, but in treaty, a turning point that echoed far beyond Palestine. While Jerusalem's story captured hearts, other towns too felt the tide. Along the coastal plain, cities capitulated one after another. Gaza, Caesarea, and beyond. Inland, hill towns bent under negotiated terms. Some garrisons resisted, only to find themselves isolated and without aid once Jerusalem had fallen. The Byzantine dream of holding Palestine dissolved like mist before the sun. The work of consolidation followed. The Muslim commanders understood conquest could not rest on battle alone. Garrison cities, Amsar, were founded and strengthened, securing troops and providing bases for administration. Damascus, Homs, and other centers became hubs of order, their soldiers billeted, their stipends recorded. Registers were drawn, stipends assigned, a rhythm of governance beginning, even as war still smoldered on the edges. Through these measures, Syria transformed. No longer a frontier contested by Rome and Persia, it became a province of the new order, linked by faith and rule to Medina. Farmers still sowed their fields, merchants still weighed coins, priests still raised their chants, but the authority above them had shifted. Where once imperial governors ruled in the name of a distant emperor, now caliphal representatives stood, their presence marked less by grandeur than by steadiness. The conquests of AD 636 to 638 reshaped more than maps. They reshaped imaginations. To Arab soldiers who had grown up among palm groves and barren wadis, the orchards and rivers of Syria seemed a land of promise. To Byzantines who had long thought desert peoples incapable of more than raids, the loss of Damascus and Jerusalem was a wound beyond comprehension. And to the faithful who had followed Muhammad from persecution to triumph, the fall of Syria's great cities confirmed what they already believed, that God's promise guided their path. As the dust of Jerusalem's surrender settled, the armies looked once more to the horizon. Beyond lay Egypt, land of grain and gold, and beyond again, Mesopotamia's fertile plains where Persia still lingered. Syria was secure, yet the storm did not pause. The same veterans who had stood at Badr, who had endured Yamama, who had triumphed at Yarmouk, now tightened their belts for further marches. From Damascus to Jerusalem, from valley to hill town, Bilād al-Shām was theirs. The gates had opened, the holy city had yielded, and the empire that once seemed immovable had lost its crown in the Levant. Ahead, the Nile waited. Palestine's winds carried hushed talk, and all of it spoke of the Nile. After Jerusalem's peaceful surrender, after Damascus and Homs had bent to new rulers, the gaze of the caliphate turned toward the west. Egypt, granary of the Mediterranean, prize of emperors, land where wheat, gold, and ship's timber sustained the Byzantine heart. Whoever held Egypt commanded not only its riches, but the sea itself. And in AD 639, Abu Ubaida's dispatches reached Medina. The time had come. The man chosen for this daring venture was Āmr ibn al-ʿAṣ. He had once stood against the Prophet, then embraced Islam and became one of its shrewdest commanders. Known for his cunning as much as his courage, Āmr understood both the sword and the pen, both the camp and the council. With perhaps 4,000 men, later joined by reinforcements, he set out across the Sinai, leading a column of riders and camels into a frontier long guarded by Byzantine forts. The march across Sinai was no easy feat. The desert stretched silent and merciless, its sand swallowing sound, its heat pressing like a weight on shoulders. But the army moved with discipline, halting at wells long prepared by scouts, resting in the shadow of dunes before pressing onward. Supply depots had been arranged every few days' march, a chain of lifelines strung across the emptiness. By the time they emerged near Pelusium, the gateway to the Nile, the soldiers were weary but intact, ready to test the strength of the empire once more. At Babylon, near modern Fustat, the real struggle began. The fortress loomed by the riverbank, its walls massive, its towers bristling with defenders. Byzantine soldiers, supported by Coptic auxiliaries, manned its parapets. For 7 long months, the siege dragged on. Tunnels were dug beneath the walls, counter-tunnels dug by defenders. Assaults surged up ladders only to be thrown back with boiling oil and stones. Yet the besiegers did not relent. They tightened their grip, harassed foraging parties, cut the fortress off from steady supply. Within the fortress, tensions grew. Cyrus, the patriarch known also as Muqawqis, acted both as religious leader and negotiator. Torn between loyalty to Constantinople and pragmatism, he sought terms even as soldiers resisted. Some say his secret dealings hastened the end. Others whisper he acted without Heraclius's approval. In the end, his words mattered less than the persistence of the siege. As the stalemate dragged on, ʿAmr pressed outward. At Heliopolis, on the edge of the fertile plain, Byzantine forces assembled to break the blockade. The battle opened under the glare of the Egyptian sun, cavalry clashing amid fields that had once fed Rome itself. The Arabs struck swiftly, splitting the Byzantine lines, driving wedges through their formations until the field was theirs. The victory opened approaches deeper into the delta, exposing towns and villages that had long trusted in imperial strength. Back at Babylon, morale waned. Supplies dwindled, reinforcements failed to arrive, and the defenders faced the truth. The empire that once sent legions in endless waves could no longer answer their cries. At last, the gates opened. The fortress surrendered under terms that spared its people, but ceded Egypt's heart to new masters. From Babylon, the tide rolled north. Alexandria, greatest port of the eastern Mediterranean, still stood, a city of marble colonnades, towering walls, and a population that dwarfed any Arab settlement. Its harbour teemed with ships. Its fortifications stretched miles. For months, it resisted, Byzantine banners fluttering above its bastions. Yet Heraclius, far away in Constantinople, could send little aid. Disease, distance, and despair hollowed his defences. In AD 642, Alexandria capitulated. The terms were generous, churches stood, families kept their homes, but the imperial eagles were lowered, never to rise again over Egypt. Amid the conquest, a new foundation was laid. At Fustat, beside Babylon's old fortress, the Muslims established their first garrison city in Egypt. Mud brick houses rose swiftly, mosques were planted, and the city grew into a capital that would shape centuries. From Fustat, the army could march west into Cyrenaica, south toward Nubia, or sail upon the Nile's endless waters. The conquest did not end with walls and treaties. The army secured desert routes, patrolling western tracks to guard against raids. Scouts pushed into the Libyan frontier, testing the limits of supply lines. Within 3 years, a navy was forming, fashioned from captured Byzantine vessels and timber drawn from the delta. The sea, once a Byzantine moat, began to turn into a highway for new ambitions. For Egypt's people, The change came with less blood than they had feared. Fields still yielded wheat, markets still bustled, and the Nile still rose with the flood. Taxes shifted, governors changed, but life endured. Many found relief in lighter burdens than those imposed by distant emperors. Others feared what future rule would bring. Yet the fact remained: Egypt, jewel of Byzantium, was now bound to Medina. By AD 642, the storm that had begun in the valleys of Medina and the sands of Yamama had swept across two empires' provinces. Syria lay secured, Egypt surrendered, and Persia still smouldered to the east. The veterans who rode beneath banners in Fustat could scarcely have imagined, a decade earlier, that they would stand beside the Nile as conquerors. But the march did not end here. Across the Euphrates, Persian hosts gathered again, seeking to avenge their defeats. Rostam, the great commander, readied his armies for a confrontation that would eclipse all before. As sails fluttered in Alexandria's harbour and the Nile's waters shimmered under the sun, messengers from Iraq carried tidings. A clash was coming at al-Qādisiyyah. The fate of Persia itself would hang in the balance. The canals of al-Qādisiyyah glimmered in the summer sun, water gliding past date palms heavy with fruit. Birds wheeled above, startled by the noise of armies assembling on the fertile plain. On one side stretched the ranks of Persia, banners snapping in the wind, elephants stamping the ground, cavalry tightening stirrups. On the other, the Muslim army drew up its lines, lean from long campaigns yet steady in spirit. Between them lay the land that would decide an empire's fate. The Caliph Umar had not come in person, fearing to leave Medina without its guide. Instead, he placed command in the hands of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, one of the Prophet's closest companions. Sa'd was courageous and wise, but at that time struck by illness. He directed the campaign from a raised platform within a pavilion, unable to mount his horse, relying on deputies to carry his orders into the roar of battle. Around him clustered veterans of Yamama, of Iraq, and of Syria, men whose scars bore witness to a decade of relentless war. Facing them stood Rostam Farrukhzad, Master General of Persia, a soldier whose name still commanded awe in the empire. His camp glittered with standards and silver, his warriors armored in mail, his nobles gathered to preserve a dynasty that had endured for centuries. They brought elephants to the field, beasts covered in iron plates, trunks bound with chains, tusks tipped with steel. The sight alone unnerved horses and men, for no Arab had ever fought such monsters before. Rostam trusted the beasts would shatter the invaders and turn the tide before it could shift. On the eve of battle, envoys rode between the camps. The Muslims offered terms: embrace the faith, pay tribute, or meet in arms. Rostam dismissed the proposals. "You are but desert men," he is said to have replied, "and we are the guardians of kings." With that, the die was cast. The first day opened with the thunder of hooves and the clash of arrows. Persian cavalry swept forward, their banners streaming, lances gleaming like fire in the sun. The Muslims met them with cries of Allahu Akbar. Shields locked, spears braced. Dust rose as horse and man collided, the earth trembling beneath the weight. In the center, the elephants advanced, their tusks goring, their trunks flinging men aside. Horses reared in terror, riders thrown, lines bent. Chaos threatened to unravel the Arab host, but resolve held. Archers loosed shafts into the beasts' eyes. Swordsmen darted forward to cut the leather harnesses. Daring fighters clambered beneath the monsters to sever their tendons. Slowly, painfully, the elephants faltered. The field reeked of sweat and blood, the cries of wounded animals echoing across the plain. Night fell with neither side victorious, but both marked by terrible loss. At dawn on the second day, the Persians struck again. This time they pressed hardest on the Muslim wings, hoping to collapse the line and surround the center. For hours the struggle swayed, men locked in shield-to-shield combat, blades hacking through armor. Sa'd, confined to his pavilion, sent constant messengers urging his men to endure. Among the Arab ranks rode al-Qādisiyyah ibn ʿAmr, a commander whose daring turned despair to hope. He brought reinforcements in waves, each group entering the field with loud cries as if new armies had arrived. The Persians, mistaking these for endless reserves, felt their confidence falter. By sunset, both sides still held their ground, but Persia's advantage of terror had begun to slip. The third day descended into fury. The clash did not end with dusk, but carried on through the night in a chaos remembered as Laylat al-Hara, the night of clamor. Torches flickered, shadows leapt across blades. The cries of men and beasts never ceased. Exhaustion blurred the senses, and still they fought. Spears splintered, swords dulled, arrows ran out, so warriors grappled with knives and bare hands. The battlefield became a storm of noise and madness, each man fighting as if dawn would never come. Yet dawn did come, and with it, weary survivors still locked in struggle. On the fourth day, fate intervened. A sandstorm rose suddenly from the desert, hurling grit and dust across the plain. The wind struck the Persians full in the face, blinding their archers, choking their horses. With the storm at their backs, the Muslims pressed forward with renewed fury. In the chaos, Rostam sought shelter near a canal, surrounded by his guard. But destiny found him. A warrior named Hilal ibn Ulafar broke through, striking the general down. Rostam's body was dragged into the water. His banner toppled. When news of his death spread, panic swept the Persian ranks. Soldiers fought to flee across the canals. Horses stumbled into irrigation ditches. Elephants stampeded, trampling their own lines. The once proud host dissolved into rout. Men leapt into the water, only to drown beneath their armor. Others cast down their arms and begged for quarter. By evening, the plain of al-Qādisiyyah was a wasteland of corpses and broken standards. The cost was heavy for both sides. Thousands of Arabs lay fallen, their names later recited in sorrow. Yet they had endured where Persia's might had shattered. The survivors embraced one another with tears and shouts, voices raised in gratitude. Sa'id, carried to the edge of the field, wept openly as he surveyed the fallen, both enemy and friend. His orders were clear: bury the dead with honor, tend the wounded, prepare for the next march. In Medina, word of victory reached Umar. He prostrated in thanks, yet his joy was tempered by grief for the losses. He warned his people against pride. "We are but servants," he reminded them, "and if we stray, God will humble us as quickly as he has raised us." But he did not pause the advance. Letters sped east. Press on, cross the Tigris, and take the imperial heart. The Battle of al-Qādisiyyah was more than the fall of a general or the rout of an army. It was the breaking of Persia's shield, the shattering of the confidence that had guarded their empire for centuries. Behind the Euphrates now loomed al-Madain, Ctesiphon, seat of kings, treasure house of dynasties. The men who had stood for 4 days under elephants and storm, who had fought through night and dust, now looked toward that glittering prize. Quiet settled over the canals of al-Qādisiyyah, their waters darkened by what had passed. Palms still swayed, birds returned to their perches, but history had shifted. The storm from Arabia had not broken, it had only grown. Ahead lay the White Palace, the crown of the Sasanians, and with it, the fate of an empire. Beneath the pale dawn, the Tigris gleamed, broad and restless, sweeping reeds and driftwood south toward the Gulf. On the far bank, the spires and domes of Almadain rose against the horizon. The twin cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, seat of Sasanian kings, a metropolis whose palaces had once dazzled Rome itself. Between river and walls, stretched fields trampled by refugees, markets deserted, and villages hushed by fear. The armies of Arabia had reached Persia's heart. For months after al-Qādisiyyah, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas had pressed steadily forward. Rostam was gone, the Persian host broken, but resistance lingered. Villages blocked canals, small garrisons harried the advance, bridges were burned in retreat. Yet the tide could not be stopped. The veterans who had faced elephants and night-long battle now marched with grim confidence, their banners rippling as they approached the Tigris. Before them lay the White Palace, jewel of Ctesiphon. Its vast arch, the Taki Kisra, curved above marble halls, where kings once sat robed in silk and gold. The wealth of centuries lay within its vaults, regalia of monarchs, jeweled crowns, carpets woven with emeralds and rubies. And beyond treasure, the capital held the last semblance of Sasanian authority. If Ctesiphon fell, the empire itself would stand naked, its monarch reduced to fugitive. But the Tigris barred the way. Wide, deep, and fast, it seemed an impossible obstacle. Persian defenders crowded the opposite bank, jeering across the waters, certain the Arabs could not cross. They had destroyed boats, stripped villages of rafts, and assumed the river would guard the capital where armies had failed. Yet Sa'd would not be denied. Scouts scoured the banks, engineers lashed logs and skins together, and prayers rose through the camps. At last, in a daring gamble, soldiers mounted horses and plunged into the current, clutching spears above the water, gripping manes with their free hands. They urged their mounts forward. The river swirled, men vanished beneath the flood, but others pressed on. Across the torrent, Persians fired arrows, their shouts echoing. Still the Arabs advanced, thousands strong, until the far shore trembled beneath the weight of their landing. When the first wave broke through, panic rippled along the defenders' lines. The rest of the army followed, the crossing complete, and Ctesiphon stood exposed. Its nobles, already fearful, fled eastward with King Yazdegerd III, carrying what treasures they could. Within days, the Arabs poured through the gates. What they found stunned even veterans of long campaigns. The White Palace gleamed with mosaics and gilded doors. Chests overflowed with coins stamped by generations of monarchs. Jewels caught the torchlight like stars. Among the prizes was the famed carpet of spring, a vast weaving said to stretch like a meadow in bloom, threaded with gold and precious stones. The soldiers gazed in awe, yet discipline held. Spoils were gathered, recorded, and divided by strict measure, a system that astonished those accustomed to plunder without order. Sa'd entered the White Palace, its arches soaring above him, its halls echoing with the silence of abandonment. Here kings had once dined while orchestras played. Here ambassadors from Rome and India had bent the knee. Here laws had been decreed to govern provinces from the Caucasus to the Indus. Now the chambers stood bare, their grandeur hollow. The empire of the Sasanians, centuries old, had been broken in a single campaign. But conquest did not end with palaces. Beyond Ctesiphon, Persian survivors gathered in strongholds, determined to resist. At Jalula, in the valley of the Diyala, they fortified positions, raising barricades across fields and canals. Sa'd dispatched detachments that clashed for weeks, pressing relentlessly until the garrison fell. The victory opened the roads northward, clearing paths toward the Zagros Mountains. At Tikrit, along the Tigris, defenders held stubbornly, relying on its banks as natural walls. Yet siege lines closed, and the town too yielded after fierce struggle. With each fortress subdued, the Arabs secured their hold, preventing Persia from regrouping. The pattern repeated: swift assault, patient blockade, steady expansion. Still, Yazdegerd did not abandon hope. From Hamadan and beyond, he tried to rally, sending calls for levies, urging nobles to rise. Some answered, but their efforts lacked unity. Each defeat sapped morale. Each lost town widened the cracks. The once proud empire, already weakened by decades of war with Byzantium, could not recover its balance. The flight of its king symbolized its decline. Authority now moved not from throne to throne, but from camp to camp, never secure. In the Muslim ranks, triumph mingled with awe. Many had grown up tending goats in the Hijaz, trading dates in Medina, or riding patrols around desert wells. Now they walked through marble halls, trod carpets fit for emperors, and gazed upon riches their ancestors had never dreamed existed. Yet Sayyid reminded them sternly, these spoils were not license for indulgence, but trust to be divided with fairness. He dispatched the lion's share to Medina, where Caliph Umar awaited. When the treasure reached the capital, the Caliph wept. He spread the jewels before the people, marveling not at their beauty, but at the faith that had delivered them. A nation that guards itself from greed, he said, is a nation that endures. The wealth was distributed, stipends established, soldiers' families supported. Victory thus fed not only the warriors, but the entire community. Back in Iraq, Sa'd consolidated. Garrisons were stationed along the Tigris, canals cleared for passage, roads secured against ambush. Mosques were planted within the captured towns, not as monuments of stone, but as tents of prayer, where soldiers gathered. Slowly, a new order took root. The Arabs were no longer raiders passing through. They were rulers, and their rule spread like the river that nourished the land. None forgot that Persia still breathed. The empire's armies were broken, its capital lost, but its king still lived, and nobles still plotted. From the Zagros, from the plateau, from the east beyond deserts and mountains, new hosts would be summoned. The storm had reached Ctesiphon, but the pursuit was not done. Ahead lay Hamadan, Nahāvand, and the highlands where Persia would make its final stand. The White Palace cast its shadow across the Tigris, silent testimony to what had been. Soldiers camped in its courtyards, their laughter echoing where kings once feasted. The carpets of spring were cut apart and shared. Jewels passed from hand to hand, coins weighed and counted. Yet even as they reveled in victory, the veterans knew this was no end. The empire had not yet yielded fully. Like a wounded beast, it would lash out again. And so, the march continued. From the ruins of Ctesiphon, banners turned eastward. The desert warriors who had begun at Badr, who had endured Yamama, who had triumphed at al-Qādisiyyah, now carried their cause into the mountains. The pursuit of Persia had only begun. Snow dusted the ridges above Hamadan, cold winds sweeping down from the Zagros, when Persia rallied for one final stand. Years had passed since al-Qādisiyyah, since the fall of Ctesiphon, since King Yazdegerd III had fled eastward with his court. Again and again, his forces had tried to resist. At Jalula, at Tikrit, at countless strongholds along the rivers, but always the tide pressed on. By AD 642, the scattered embers of resistance gathered into one last flame at the fortress town of Nahāvand. Here they would stake everything. Yazdegerd's summons rang across the plateau. Nobles answered, bringing retainers and levies, swelling the host to perhaps 60,000. Veteran generals took command, determined to redeem years of loss. From the palaces of Isfahan, from the valleys of Fārs, from the plains of Media, soldiers poured in, armored in mail, armed with spears and bows. They built trenches, raised barricades, and fortified their camp, certain that the Arabs would bleed themselves dry against prepared defenses. Persian pride, battered but unbroken, concentrated into this single effort. The Muslims, though fewer in number, marched with confidence born of a decade of victories. Caliph Umar, still in Medina, entrusted leadership to al-Nu'man ibn Muqarrin, a seasoned commander known for humility and courage. With him rode veterans who had crossed the Tigris, stormed Ctesiphon, and carried banners into Armenia and Khūzistān. They were not unscarred. Many bore wounds from al-Qādisiyyah. Some walked with limps. Others had lost brothers in earlier battles. But their spirits remained unshaken. When the two armies faced each other near Nahāvand, the Persians remained behind their fortifications, daring the Arabs to attack. Days passed with skirmishes and archery duels, the Muslims probing but unwilling to hurl themselves into hopeless slaughter. The stalemate threatened to stretch into months, with neither side yielding. Al-Nu'man knew he needed guile to break the deadlock. Feigning weakness, he ordered a deliberate retreat. The Muslim lines pulled back from the trenches, leaving gaps, their banners drooping, their movements slow. Word spread through the Persian camp. The invaders faltered, fear gnawed at them. Exhaustion had sapped their strength. Persian commanders, convinced the moment had come, resolved to strike. They abandoned the safety of their fortifications and surged into the open field, their cavalry charging with cries meant to shake the desert warriors once and for all. That was the moment al-Nu'man had awaited. With a signal, the Arab lines wheeled and closed. Hidden detachments leapt from gullies and ravines, striking flanks with sudden ferocity. The supposed retreat reversed into attack. Dust rose in choking clouds. Steel clashed, and the Persians found themselves caught in the open, robbed of their advantage. The battle raged through the day, each side pouring every ounce of strength into the struggle. Persian heavy cavalry thundered forward, scattering infantry, only to be met by countercharges from Arab horsemen who darted in and out, spears flashing. Arrows darkened the air, shields splintered, men fell by the hundreds. In the thick of fighting, al-Nu'man pressed ever forward, urging his men on with shouts, his sword gleaming in the sun. But fate struck cruelly. A spear pierced al-Nu'man, and he fell amid the tumult. For a moment, despair threatened to seize the Muslim ranks. Yet word spread quickly. Conceal his death. Do not let the army falter. His brother took command, carrying forward his banner. The men, unwilling to dishonor their fallen leader, fought with renewed fury. What seemed a loss turned to iron resolve. By evening, the Persian army collapsed. Their generals slain, their formations broken, they fled in every direction. The battlefield of Nahāvand became a slaughterhouse, its trenches filled with corpses, its plain littered with armor. Chroniclers would call it al-Fath, al-Futu, the victory of victories, because it shattered forever the ability of Persia to muster another grand defense. In the aftermath, towns across the plateau opened their gates. Hamadan yielded, followed by Isfahan, then Ray. Cities that had once sent tribute to Ctesiphon now bent to Medina. The empire that had stretched from the Oxus to the Gulf shrank into fragments, its king a fugitive, its armies scattered. Yazdegerd fled eastward once more, clinging to hope in distant provinces, but the heart of Persia was gone. For the Muslims, the spoils of Nahāvand seemed almost endless. Weapons, armor, horses, and treasures left abandoned in the rout. Yet victory was measured not only in riches, but in territory. With Persia's main host destroyed, the road lay open into the deeper provinces. Ādharbayjān in the north, Fārs in the south, Khūzistān by the Gulf, and beyond them, the vast plateau of Khurāsān. The storm that had begun in the Hijaz had now extinguished an empire older than Alexander's march. In Medina, Umar received the tidings with tears. He mourned al-Nu'man, praising his humility and sacrifice, but he also recognized the magnitude of the triumph. This, he declared, is the victory that has broken Persia's back. Yet he cautioned his generals not to be intoxicated. The work of garrisoning, organizing, and protecting the conquered land mattered as much as battlefield glory. Orders went forth to establish stability, build strongholds, and guard against uprisings. For the Persians, Nahāvand was tragedy. Families mourned fathers and sons. Nobles watched estates slip away. Priests lamented the decline of fire temples that had blazed for centuries. But history had turned. The Sasanian dynasty, once proud heir of Cyrus and Darius, could no longer stand. Its king wandered, its capital lay in enemy hands, its fields belonged to new masters, yet resistance would not vanish overnight. In the years to come, Persian generals and nobles would fight again in Armenia, in Fārs, in Khūzistān, and in the Far East. But those would be fragments, desperate struggles without unity. The empire as it had existed was gone. Nahāvand marked its death knell. When soldiers who survived returned to campfires that night, they sang of fallen comrades, of al-Nu'man's charge, of the dust and blood that sealed Persia's fate. Some lifted cups of water and whispered prayers for brothers lost. Others gazed eastward, toward lands yet unconquered, wondering how far the banners would fly. The plains still stank of death, but the future already beckoned. Nahāvand, the victory of victories, had changed the world, and from its fields the storm rolled onward, to Armenia, to Fārs, to Khūzistān, where new chapters awaited in the tale of conquest. Cold winds swept down from the Caucasus as Arab riders advanced through narrow passes, where the snow clung stubbornly to shaded cliffs. The men, born of desert heat, wrapped themselves in cloaks and leaned against the bitter chill, their horses snorting clouds of steam into the mountain air. Below them, valleys lay dotted with villages where smoke rose thinly from chimneys, and church bells tolled in defiance of the approaching host. Armenia and Ādharbayjān, lands long balanced between Byzantium and Persia, now stood at the edge of a new tide. The armies of Medina had not paused after Nahāvand. That victory had broken Persia's back, but its arms still thrashed. In the north, local rulers gathered militias, hoping to hold mountain strongholds against the invaders. They had watched the fall of Hamadan, Isfahan, and Rai, but they believed the ridges and citadels of their homeland could do what Persia's great fields could not. The Arabs marched steadily onward, their veterans hardened by years of campaigning across plains and rivers, ready now to climb. Skirmishes erupted at Ādharbayjān, where Persian contingents tried to block the passes, but their resistance was swept aside. The nobles saw what had happened to their neighbors and sued for terms, offering tribute to preserve their estates. News of capitulation spread quickly through the valleys. Some princes yielded at the first demand, unwilling to risk devastation. Others resisted briefly, only to discover that no imperial army was coming to relieve them. Byzantine banners no longer flew across the mountains, and Persian messengers had grown silent. The people weighed survival against loyalty and chose survival. Treaties were struck, coins and flocks delivered, and the Arab armies pressed farther north, their banners rising even in places where snow and ice seemed to belong to another world. Veterans of Yamama, men who had grown up under the palm groves of the Hijaz, now pitched their tents among fir trees and icy streams. While the north bent under tribute, the south still burned with resistance. In Khūzistān, the land of rivers that fed into the Gulf, Persian forces regrouped, determined to slow the advance. Avars stood in their way, canals protecting its approaches, defenders confident behind their walls. Arab columns clashed with its garrison in sharp fighting that spilled across dikes and fields. The siege stretched for weeks before hunger broke the resolve of its people and the gates opened. From there, the road led to Susa, ancient city whose kings had once ruled empires before Persia itself was born. Its walls gleamed in the sun, but the spirit of its defenders faltered quickly, and it too surrendered. Its streets spared plunder in return for submission. Further west lay Tustar, proud fortress city ringed by watercourses and fertile fields. Here the Persians made their hardest stand. Commanded by Hormuzan, a noble known for cunning and valor, the defenders resisted with skill. They harried Arab patrols, cut supply lines, and launched sudden night raids against the camps. The siege dragged on month after month, the attackers forced to dig trenches and raise embankments under constant harassment. Yet persistence wore down resistance. Tustar's walls finally yielded, and Hormuzan was taken alive. His capture was no ordinary prize. He was sent across the desert to Medina, where the Caliph himself awaited. Clad in silks, even as a prisoner, proud despite chains, Hormuzan was ushered into the presence of Umar. Before the ruler of a city of mud brick houses, the Persian noble stood with the bearing of a king. He asked for water before speaking, and when the vessel was brought, he hesitated, fearing execution might strike as he drank. Umar promised his safety until he had finished. Hormuzan, seizing the moment, flung the water to the ground, declaring he could never finish what he no longer possessed. Bound by his word, the Caliph spared him. So ended one of Persia's most seasoned commanders, undone not by arms alone, but by fate and wit. While Hormuzan's saga unfolded in Medina, the campaigns continued across Khūzistān. Marshes and rivers turned the land into a labyrinth, yet the Arabs adapted quickly. They seized boats and ferries, converted them into makeshift rafts for cavalry, and learned to maneuver along the waterways. Supply trains floated beside marching columns, barges carrying grain and fodder, while horses splashed through shallows. Villagers along the Shatt al-Arab watched the newcomers move with a speed they had not thought possible in such terrain. Resistance faded as garrisons saw one fortress after another fall, their comrades unable to stem the tide. By the mid-640s, Khūzistān was secured, its canals patrolled, its towns garrisoned. But to the east, Fārs remained, the ancestral homeland of the Sasanian kings, the heart of Persian pride. Here, temples still flamed in devotion to Ahura Mazda, and nobles still swore oaths to the crown of Yazdegerd, though he himself had fled beyond their reach. The land fought fiercely, determined to keep alive the embers of empire. Battles raged near Istakhur and Isfahan. Sieges weighed upon valleys once home to Persepolis. Resistance flared again and again, but each time it was broken, worn down by relentless pressure. One by one, the ancient cities yielded. Priests kept their fires alive. but the armies that once protected them were gone. Everywhere the Arabs advanced, a pattern emerged. Not every town was stormed in blood. Many chose negotiation. Tribute was promised, hostages exchanged, and local rulers allowed to keep their thrones under new authority. Where resistance stiffened, sieges followed. Patient, grinding, but steady. The conquerors did not rush blindly. They advanced step by step, breaking resistance, planting garrisons, and then moving onward. The veterans who had once fought in desert wadis and palm groves now walked through marble halls and prayed in towns older than memory. For the soldiers, the campaigns were more than conquest. They were encounters with lands beyond imagination, snowbound ridges where the air itself seemed to freeze, marshes buzzing with insects, fire temples glowing in twilight, churches ringing their bells at dawn. Men who had grown up in Medina or Mecca found themselves tasting breads spiced with herbs unknown at home, drinking water from icy streams instead of desert wells. Some longed for the familiar sun and sand. Others marveled at the abundance before them. Yet all pressed forward, for the work was not done. By decade's end, Persia's north and south had bowed. Armenia and Ādharbayjān agreed to pay tribute, their rulers humbled but left alive. Khūzistan's fortresses lay in Arab hands, its rivers controlled, its noble Hormuzan a captive in Medina. Fārs, cradle of Sasanian kings, had fallen city by city, its people left to mourn the empire's ruin. Yazdegerd still wandered, a fugitive clinging to distant hopes, but his homeland no longer answered his call. The caliphate stretched now from the Taurus Mountains to the shores of the Gulf, a realm unimaginable only a generation earlier. But victory carried burdens as well as glory. Provinces needed governors, taxes needed collectors, and garrisons needed provisions. Roads had to be guarded, canals cleared, markets kept open. Soldiers who had marched for years now settled into camps that grew into permanent towns, anchors of a new order rising across conquered lands. And still the horizon beckoned. Beyond the mountains lay Sīstān and Khurāsān, rich provinces at the edge of the known world. Beyond them stretched Makrān and the frontiers of India. Yazdegerd himself still lived, fleeing ever eastward, seeking allies among distant lords. The storm had conquered Persia's north and south, but the chase was not yet done. The march pressed on. The deserts of Persia gave way to new horizons as the Arab armies pressed ever eastward. The Zagros ridges faded behind them, and before them stretched lands few of them had ever imagined. Sīstān with its wind-blown plains, Khurāsān with its fertile valleys and caravan towns, and farther still the distant frontier of Makrān, where the mountains kissed the Indian Ocean. Here, in the years after the fall of Fārs and Khūzistān, the storm reached the edges of the known world. After Nahāvand, Persia's spine was broken, but its king still lived. Yazdegerd III had fled from one province to another, seeking refuge first in Isfahan, then in Fārs, then farther east. Each time the Arabs advanced, each time his hosts melted away, and each time he carried the symbols of royalty with him, crown, robes, and the fading loyalty of nobles. He was still young, still proud, and still determined to reclaim what his ancestors had ruled for centuries. But he was a king without a capital, a sovereign without an army, moving ever closer to the horizons of his empire. The Arab columns pursued steadily. From Basra and Kufa, new garrisons founded on the rivers of Iraq, troops were dispatched under commanders like Abdullah ibn ʿAmr and Rabi ibn Ziyad. These were not reckless raids, but measured campaigns designed to extend authority, subdue provinces, and deny Yazdegerd the base he sought. Each march carried the veterans farther from the familiar valleys of the Euphrates, across highlands and deserts into lands where languages shifted, customs differed, and the very climate tested endurance. Sīstān was the first threshold. Its winds blew fierce across flat plains, raising storms of dust that blinded eyes and scoured skin raw. Its rivers carved fertile strips where towns clung to life, while fortresses dotted ridges and guarded the routes eastward. Here resistance lingered, stubborn and sharp. Local lords rallied fighters, knowing that if Sīstān fell, the path to Khurāsān lay open. Battles flared near Zaranj, where Arab cavalry clashed with defenders who knew every channel and marsh. The fighting was hard, supply lines stretched to breaking, but discipline carried the day. One by one, strongholds yielded, tribute was agreed, and Sīstān bowed under the new order. From there, the armies turned northward into Khurāsān, the jewel of the east. Unlike the barren deserts, this was a land of cities and valleys, of caravans laden with silk and spices, of markets alive with merchants from India, China, and beyond. To capture Khurāsān was to control the arteries of the Silk Road, to hold the gateway between Persia and Central Asia. The Arabs marched first toward Merv, that oasis city whose walls gleamed in the sun. Resistance was fierce at first, but the pattern that had marked so many earlier campaigns repeated itself. Negotiation, siege, capitulation. Merv opened its gates, its markets spared, its tribute promised. From there, the tide rolled outward. En-Shapur, Herat, Balkh. Each fell in turn, their rulers making terms. Their people spared destruction in exchange for loyalty and taxes. The veterans marveled at Khurāsān. They walked among bazaars where traders spoke tongues they had never heard, where fabrics shimmered with colors unknown, where horses of unmatched breed stamped in corrals. They tasted fruits from orchards watered by mountain streams, saw temples and monasteries standing side by side, heard chants of Buddhists mingling with the hymns of Christians and the prayers of Zoroastrians. It was a land vast and diverse, unlike the deserts of Arabia, yet it now came under banners carried from Medina. While Khurāsān yielded city by city, Yazdegerd fled farther east. His appeals for help grew desperate. He sent envoys to the Turkic tribes beyond the Oxus, begging them to rise against the invaders. Some offered promises, others only silence. He carried with him the last treasures of his dynasty, scattering jewels and coins in payment to wavering allies. But each time he turned, he found the Arabs advancing behind him, relentless as the desert wind. Southward, the campaigns pressed into Makrān, where the mountains sloped down to the sea. This was a harsh frontier, dry and unforgiving, its villages small and scattered, its routes long and perilous. Arab scouts pushed through rocky passes, their camels struggling on narrow tracks, their soldiers thirsty in the blazing heat. They found little wealth, little population, only stubborn resistance from clans who guarded their valleys with ferocity. Victories were won, strongholds subdued, but the land offered more burden than bounty. The commanders recognized that the limits of advance had been reached. Beyond Makrān lay the fringes of India, vast and unknown, but their orders from Medina were clear. Do not press too far where supply lines cannot follow. By AD 651, the chase of Yazdegerd reached its end. Abandoned by allies, betrayed by those who had once sheltered him, the King of Kings fell not on a battlefield, but in flight. In the small town of Merv, he sought refuge, but a miller struck him down for the wealth he carried. With his death, the line of the Sasanian monarchs ended. its crown extinguished in obscurity. No palace, no army, no temple mark the end of an empire that had rivaled Rome for centuries. Only the dust of exile and the hand of fate. The Arabs marked the moment with both triumph and reflection. They had pursued the last Sasanian king across half a continent, from the palaces of Ctesiphon to the frontier of Central Asia. In scarcely 2 decades, they had toppled one of the world's greatest dynasties, taken its capitals, seized its provinces, and extended their authority from the shores of the Mediterranean to the Oxus. Yet for all the victories, they also knew the burden of governance had grown heavier with every conquest. Garrison towns swelled, Kufa, Basra, Fustat, becoming anchors for troops and administrators. Governors were appointed in faraway provinces, scribes recorded treaties and tribute, and soldiers rotated between campaigns and watchful peace. The veterans who had once roamed in search of battle now guarded markets, canals, and roads. Their spears turned to tools of order as much as weapons of war. Still, the sense of destiny lingered. From Sistan's wind-blown fields to Khurāsān's caravan towns, from the marshes of Khūzistān to the rocky coast of Makrān, the storm had swept without pause. It had carried men who once herded goats in the Hijaz into cities older than memory, who had once prayed in fear at Medina into palaces of marble and gold. And with the death of Yazdegerd, the last obstacle of the old order was gone. The conquests had reached the edges of the known world. To the north lay the steppes of Turkic tribes. To the east, the mountains of India. To the south, the endless sea. The empire of the Sasanians was no more. Its lands absorbed, its people now subjects of a new dominion. Yet within that dominion, storms of another kind were already gathering. For the unity that had carried the Arabs so far would soon face strains from within. For now, the soldiers rested on the frontiers of Khurāsān, watching caravans pass, hearing the strange tongues of foreign merchants, and marveling at how far their march had brought them. They had pursued a king to his death, toppled a dynasty, and claimed a realm larger than they could once imagine. The desert winds that had begun at Bārdar and Yamāmah now blew across the mountains of Persia and the plains of Central Asia. And as the banners of Medina fluttered over distant frontiers, the world knew that a new age had dawned. From the orchards of Damascus to the canals of Basra, from the markets of Fustat to the caravan roads of Khurāsān, the caliphate now stretched across 3 continents. What had begun as a persecuted community in the alleys of Mecca had become a dominion greater than any Arab could have imagined a generation earlier. By the middle of the 7th century, the storm had reached its height. Yet even at its zenith, clouds gathered on the horizon. The veterans who had marched east and west now settled in garrison cities, the Amzar, foundations of a new order. Kufa rose along the Euphrates plain, its streets laid in careful grid, its mosques echoing with the prayers of soldiers who had once fought at Yamāmah and al-Qādisiyyah. Basra grew beside the Gulf, its harbours filling with ships that carried tribute from Khūzistān and beyond. Fustat thrived on the Nile, where its mosque and markets anchored the conquest of Egypt. These cities became more than barracks. They were centres of administration, places where stipends were distributed, where governors judged disputes, where families grew around the tents of warriors. The desert fighters had become settlers, their lances still at hand, but their lives tied to fields, canals, and trade. The conquests demanded order, and order required system. The Diwan was created, a register that recorded the names of those who had fought, and the shares of stipends owed to them. Veterans of Bārdar stood highest, their allotments greatest, while newer recruits received less. Coins from Persian treasuries and Egyptian granaries flowed into Medina and outward again, sustaining an army spread from Libya to Central Asia. The Caliph Umar oversaw it all with stern care. He walked the streets of Medina at night, ensuring no family lacked bread, and yet his letters directed governors thousands of miles away. His authority bound the realm as surely as the desert binds the oasis. But the victories did not come without strain. The frontiers demanded constant vigilance. Along the Mediterranean, Byzantine fleets probed the coasts, raiding ports and testing defenses. In Armenia, tribes shifted their loyalties with the winds, sometimes paying tribute, sometimes rebelling. In Egypt, remnants of imperial garrisons stirred unrest, and in Iraq, Persian nobles conspired in shadows. Soldiers rotated between peace and war, summoned to ride at a moment's notice, their stipends tied to service as much as to settlement. The great caliph, who had steered this expansion, met his end not on the battlefield, but in the mosque of Medina. In AD 644, while leading prayer, Umar was struck by the blade of a slave. Wounded grievously, he called a council to decide his successor. With his death, the community wept, for he had guided them through the fall of empires with a hand both firm and just. Into his place stepped Uthman ibn Affan, elder of Quraysh, companion of the Prophet, generous in wealth and gentle in manner. Under Uthman, the conquests did not halt. In Khurāsān, new thrusts carried banners to Merv and Nishapur, pushing farther toward the Oxus. In Armenia and Ādharbayjān, treaties were reinforced, strongholds taken, and frontiers patrolled. In Sīstān, Arab detachments pressed toward Makrān, testing the limits of advance before terrain and scarcity forced them to pause. The frontiers seemed endless, each victory opening the path to another horizon. Yet within, tensions grew. The very system that bound the armies together also bred rivalry. Stipends favored early companions, creating resentment among newer recruits. Governors, appointed over vast and wealthy provinces, accumulated influence that unsettled old balances. Families of Quraysh gained prominence, and whispers spread that favoritism overshadowed fairness. Still, outwardly, the empire gleamed. Markets of Kufa overflowed with Persian silks. Basra's harbours bustled with Indian spices. Fustat's granaries swelled with Egyptian wheat. Horses bred in Syrian fields carried soldiers across steppes. Swords forged in Yemeni forges flashed in distant lands. Veterans recalled their campaigns with pride, telling their children of Yarmouk and Qādisiyyah, of Damascus and Ctesiphon, of Alexandria and Nahāvand. To the wider world, the Arabs seemed unstoppable, their banners rising where once Rome and Persia had stood unchallenged. But history does not rest on triumph alone. In Medina, murmurs of discontent spread. Some accused governors of hoarding wealth, others of harsh rule. Letters arrived from Egypt, from Kufa, from Basra, carrying complaints. The Caliph, gentle and unwilling to rule with iron severity, hesitated to act with the firmness of Umar. Dissent, once a murmur, grew into anger. By AD 656, the storm that had carried the Arabs across continents turned inward. Discontent in Egypt led rebels to march on Medina. The city that had birthed the caliphate now trembled with turmoil. In his house, surrounded by companions loyal to him, Uthman read from the Quran as the rebels broke through. His blood fell upon the open page, martyring him within the city that had once been the beacon of unity. With his death, the world of the Rashidun reached its zenith and its fracture. The empire stretched farther than Alexander's, its armies undefeated, its coffers rich. But unity cracked. Veterans who had once fought shoulder to shoulder now took sides in disputes that would harden into civil war. The storm that had shattered Byzantium's hold on Syria and crushed Persia's crown now threatened to turn upon itself. Yet for a moment, even amid grief and turmoil, the scale of what had been achieved could not be denied. In scarcely 25 years, the Arabs had risen from scattered tribes to rulers of an empire stretching from Libya's coast to the Oxus River. They had toppled dynasties older than memory, planted new cities where none had stood, and carried their faith into lands of snow, marsh, and sea. The Rashidun Caliphate stood as both a miracle and a paradox, fragile in its politics, yet mighty in its reach. As the sun set over Medina that fateful year, veterans sat in the courtyards of Kufa, Basra, and Fustat, telling stories to their children. They spoke of the Prophet who had guided them, of caliphs who had led them, of battles where the few had triumphed over the many. They did not know what storms would come next, what divisions would scar the unity they had fought for, but they knew they had lived through an age unlike any before. The winds that had once carried caravans across the desert had carried armies across the world. The Rashidun Caliphate had reached its height, and though the gathering clouds promised trials yet to come, its legacy had already reshaped history.